From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope that you and yours are sheltering in place in a comfortable environment, and we look forward to greeting you back at the Yacht Club just as soon as conditions permit. Our guest today demonstrates that the most fascinating people have very diverse backgrounds and have crossed professional fields. She started sailing at age 6 on her dad's C&C 25 in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. And in 1997, sailed across the Atlantic in a metal-hulled 67-footer as part of the BT Global Challenge. Then in the year 2000, she bought a 105 of her own and began racing Elmo, which she reminds us is the patron saint of sailors. After getting a BA in economics from Wellesley College and an MBA from Duke, she spent 25 years on Wall Street as a financial analyst before going back and getting a master's in information at Rutgers, and in 2017 becoming the finance librarian at Princeton. In 2018, after discovering research by New Bedford Whaling Museum and Mystic Museum, and faced with that academic axiom, publish or perish, Bobby decided to do a paper on the financial returns in the whaling industry and is the subject of our Wednesday Yachting Luncheon talk today. So Bobby Coffey, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Hi, I'm really pleased to be here. I'm very sorry it's not in person because that would make this even better. As Ron said, I've been sailing my entire life and was so pleased to find that the New Bedford Whaling Museum and Mystic Seaport put together a large spreadsheet that included all the known whaling voyages and what they brought back from sea. What I applied was some financial analysis and assessment of what it cost to send them to sea, and put together how much the whaling owners, the whaling boat owners, made for this process for the 1800s. As many people realize, during the 1800s, oil wasn't even discovered till 1859. So whale oil was what was used to light homes and for industrial processes. Put together a slide deck. I did a version of this to the New Bedford Whaling Museum in 2019. However, this presentation focuses in San Francisco relative to the overall industry.
So Bobby, before you get going, in the background, are you speaking to me from your home in New Jersey?
Yes, I'm very fortunate. I live in the house I grew up in, and I live 2 blocks from the ocean. So I'm very pleased to come to you from New Jersey on my side porch.
Perfect. Couldn't be better.
Could not be better. So Let's talk about the voyage data and the vessel data. So there's the data from whalinghistory.org, which is a site supported by the New Bedford Whaling Museum and Mystic. And I pulled off what they call the American offshore whaling voyages. This had close to 13,000, 14,000 voyages all together. But because I just wanted to look at the 1800s, I excluded a bunch of voyages. So those not happening between 1800 or finishing between 1800 and 1899, voyages that didn't have known harbors or vessels with unknown names, all the foreign harbors. So back then, Hawaii was a foreign harbor. And often the data came through with blank about the catch. I went through some of the printed material that does still exist about what these voyages brought home. And if the voyage was clean, which meant these guys went to sea and returned with nothing, I kept zeros. If no information could be found, I excluded it because maybe it just wasn't recorded and that voyage did just fine. Similarly, I double checked for actual dates of when they left and when they returned and made some estimations if it couldn't be found. June was used as a return month if nothing was found, and the 15th was used as the day of the month. Similarly, July was used as a departure month when no other data was found. Often the data was so weak that I could see a boat returned and left again in a year, and I assumed, therefore, they showed up in June and left in July, and it took a month to re-outfit the boat. Ambergris, which is a byproduct of some sperm whales, was also added to the results.
What is ambergris?
Ambergris is a product that is often still used in high-end perfumes and other products, but it really only happens in a whale that has some disease going on. So it's a very expensive product and used still today, as I said, in perfumes.
So it's a type of oil or extract from the whale, but it's
Yes,
not used for burning. It's used as a fragrance or something.
yes. And this total reduced the total count to 11,500 voyages done by 2,000 vessels out from 68 harbors. So
Wow.
this was a huge industry for the time. As a mental note, each of the times these boats went to sea, it was about $1 million in today's money.
And so what percent of GDP in those days was the whaling industry?
I haven't actually figured that out, but it was significant as it was what was used for oil. So this is the fleet size over time. So it grew from 18 boats in 1800 to 750 boats in 1845 and closed 1899 with 42 vessels. Now, if you take a look just at the San Francisco fleet, it started in 1850 and grew to 51 in 1892 and closed with about 35 to 40 boats in 1899 as it became the primary harbor in the late 1800s. So as you can see, I highlighted the San Francisco boats in blue.
So the San Francisco boats represented almost half and then ultimately more than half of all the whaling vessels at the end of the trade.
I'm using return calculations that are very commonly used in finance. So the ending value over the beginning value divided by 1 over the number of years minus 1. Now, there were some assumptions made. The structure of the whaling industry meant that the owners took 70% and the crew was paid as a percent of the take and was assumed to take 30. Barrels were assumed to contain 31.5 gallons, and this comes from literature. And therefore, the owner's take was 70% of everything that was brought back. The vessels were valued by the type of rig it had. Sloops were smaller than schooners and brigs, and ships and barks were larger. Steamers were the largest, and steamers showed up very much at the end of the century. So I used census data from Massachusetts. I used a speech done by a representative from Massachusetts, and I used the whaling newspaper of the time, the Whaleman's Shipping List, a weekly newspaper for the whaling industry. It showed when boats left the harbor, when it came home, and what it cost.
When it says median sold in sale, what is that? What is sold at 5,200?
So if a boat was sold, it often made the press. And when a boat sank, it often made the press. So I went through the Whaleman's Shipping List, which started in 1843 through 1899, and collected all the newspaper clippings of how much was recorded when a boat was sold and how much the boat was valued at when it sailed. And the value when sailed often would only come up when the boat was sunk. This is how I came up with estimated valuations for the boats. To do a financial analysis, you need to know what the value was at the beginning to be able to assess what they returned on that particular valuation.
So 5,200 when sold means that the boat without a catch on it is worth.
The boat was valued at 5,200 without the sales, without any food, without anything, just the hull pretty much. And when the boat was sailed, it would have all the food for the crew. It would have the sails. It would have potentially barrels for the oil. It would be equipped to go to sea. So it would have all the equipment to go to sea.
So that's kind of the comparison of just a raw boat and then a fully equipped.
Very much so.
Okay, this is the empty building, and then this is all ready to go to work.
Yes.
And go and get.
This is turnkey versus empty.
Perfect. Okay.
When I was estimating the value of outfits, which is the fully provisioning of the boats, I based it off those resources as well. And for food estimations, I based it on per man, per month food costs of about $6.20 based on estimations from a number of different sources. And the assumption was 14 men on a sloop, 18 men on a schooner, 22 men on a brig, 30 men on the larger ships, the ships and the barks, and about 40 men on the steamers. The steamers, again, were the largest boats. And the outfitting costs were based on the data, which came from mostly the mid-century of 1844 and were inflation adjusted. As we all know, vessels can depreciate. So I used a 2% annual depreciation. Vessels of that kind were wood, and annual maintenance I assumed to be 6%. And insurance was optional. And I assumed based on some of the readings that it was 2.5%.
What percent of the ships were insured?
I only have that it costs 2.5% a year to insure a boat.
Do you have a guesstimate? Do you think half of them were insured?
I would assume about half were insured because the cost came out of the cruise numbers more than it came out of the owner's numbers. And let's talk about some of the results. There are a number of things that I'm going to highlight here. The overall bond returns for the century was 4.6%. And for the 50 years that there was whaling out of San Francisco, it was 4.4%. Now, if we go over to here, these are the overall insured returns for the overall industry. And if one had invested in the mean boat of every year, the return was 4.7%. If one had invested in the total, every boat, the return would have been just under 6%. Now, the highest return was a boat out of New London, and it had a 4,700% return.
Why was that so high, by the way? Do we know why?
It had such a short time on the water for its catch. So that's a good topic because one of the reasons I believe San Francisco had such high returns was it spent, their boats on average spent fewer days at sea at under a year versus the overall returns were almost 2 years. So here, the mean return for the entire fleet was almost 34%, at 33.6%. And if you invested in the mean boat for every year, it was 25% or 24.6%. So San Francisco had much higher returns relative to the overall fleet, which is really impressive. And I think part of it comes from so many whales being in Alaska and that area. And Alaska is a lot closer to San Francisco than the East Coast, where this was before the Panama Canal, and the boats had to go below South America and past Cape Horn to get up to Alaska. So it was a very long journey for the East Coast boats.
And so let me ask you, up here on the left-hand column, the second from the left column, voyages, I see that the total database is 11,500 voyages, and the San Francisco's 719 voyages. So San Francisco is about 6% of the total whaling market and the most profitable.
Yes, very much so. And again, of the 68 harbors that I analyzed, this was the only one on the West Coast.
Also, I'd like to look at how the years change. On the left-hand column, you thoughtfully have decades. And I noticed that the whaling trade starts out kind of being a losing proposition in 1800. The first couple of rows, 1800, 1820, 1830, it's a losing. And then it's barely making money to 1850. And then they seem to get it together in the latter part of the century and generate up to 13% returns. But in San Francisco, you show beginning in the middle of the century, because there's nobody in San Francisco before 1850 when the gold rush happens. The returns are significantly better. They're like basically better than 2x all the time.
Yes.
And you're saying the main reason is because they were based closer to the catch, which is up in Alaska, being closer than they are for the Boston ships, which had to go to the tip of South America.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. What percent of all the whales that were caught in Alaska versus off the Atlantic banks and so on?
That material would be in each one of the shipping logs, and you'd have to go through all the writings, and all the shipping logs are not out there. And I know how exhausted I am after even spending 1 or 2 days on a boat. So the idea that these guys were spending 311 days on average on a boat, I mean, I don't usually like the crew that much after 4 or 5 days. So
Spoken like a transatlantic sailor.
So the idea that these people were on the boat for over 300 must have been quite interesting.
Yeah, I don't think that they were taking 2 showers a day, the guys on the crew.
I doubt it. And I don't think the food was all that tasty.
No veal Prince Orloff served, do you think?
Yes, they didn't. But they didn't have a tender to bring up dinner in the evenings.
I get it. Yeah, I don't think the wine was quite as good.
And if you were crew, you probably weren't getting the wine at all. So let me scoot over to some of the more interesting ones. I'd already mentioned the greatest return was the schooner era out of New London in 1890. As I mentioned, it was at the sea to a very short time. It was only in the sea for 78 days. And it therefore calculates, this is without insurance, 4,800% return. Now, the greatest catch did come out of San Francisco.
So it goes to sea for 78 days. It comes back with 21,000 round numbers value. It costs $5,000 to have the boat. It costs $2,000 to outfit it. When everything's all put together, the boat makes a profit of, what's the raw number? $14,000 or so?
$14,000 is the profit to the owners.
Right.
70% of the take.
Right. So they make $14,000 profit. And you're saying your total cost of goods sold or COGS is 6 plus 2 plus 900 plus 100?
14,000 is the number you came back with. The percent of the catch to the owner.
That's net profit. That's
right.
net.
The value of the boat is the value of the boat. The boat was $6,000, and the depreciation for being out only
Got it.
78 days was $106.
Got it. So the net return is $14,000, but what do we consider the investment?
The beginning value was the value of the boat.
Okay.
The value of the outfit, so the food and the sales and everything. So the original investment was about $9,000.
Okay, the greatest catch
is the Mary Hume out of San Francisco. This boat was again in the 1890s. It was at sea for almost 900 days.
Wow.
So that's, 2.5 years? The value of the catch was almost $400,000. The value of the vessel, the outfit to go to sea, and the food was significant. And in the analysis of the catch, about 262,000 was the value of the catch to the owner. The value of the vessel, again, remained 65,000. The value of depreciation is subtracted. And 3 years of depreciation, or 900 days of depreciation, was about $12,000. When the boat went to sea, it was 65,000 for the boat, 14,000 for the fuel, and about 9,000 for the food. So the return here is 68%. The longest voyage was the bark the Nile. And this boat spent 12 years at sea. And I can only imagine how the crew really hated each other by then. The catch was significant. Again, not as significant as the Mary Hume, but it was 144,000. And because of the time at sea, this boat's total return was 2.7%.
So I wonder, in that case, those people might have just, interesting dynamic, because you also, those of us who've done ocean races, it's a wonderful Zen thing we're doing in ocean race, certainly not like what these guys were suffering, but they also might have, maybe they just got into it. I mean, 12 years at sea, that is one incredible voyage. That's a lifetime.
Yes, and I have a feeling the crew turned over a fair amount. So if you're suddenly in Hawaii and you don't want to go to Alaska, you get off.
Right.
And you run away and you abandon your take of the total.
The captain's continuing, maybe he's liking what he's doing, but the financial return was terrible. I can see that.
Yes.
Talk to us about the investor types that would engage in this activity.
In almost all cases, it was a venture capital-like structure where there were a number of families or gentlemen that put in money. And these were the equivalent of syndicates where you'd own an eighth of the boat or a quarter of the boat, and therefore a quarter of the return when it came back. And in speaking with the curator at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, it does not seem like an independent market for shares in these vessels actually happened. Once you bought a share in the vessel, these seem to have been held until the boats came home.
So these are the equivalent of private investors in a private, not publicly tradable business. Fascinating. Wonderful insight.
Now, taking a look at the financial returns overall. While for the industry, only 3% had returns greater than 100%. In San Francisco, this was 20%. Now, taking a look at the cumulative returns, 47% of the vessels came back with returns less than zero for the overall industry. And yet for the San Francisco-based vessels, only 39% came back with returns less than zero. So with the overall industry, it was almost a coin toss if you were going to make any money. With San Francisco, it was a 60% chance that you would.
I want to ask you another question. When you sail up to Mystic Seaport, on both sides of the river going up, there are these incredible big houses, and people have said to me that these are from whaling captains. The difference in returns from the different whaling ships, probably, does that help explain the incredibly high pay that successful whaling captains were able to command?
Yeah, this is the delta between those that got lucky and those that didn't. I mean, there's probably a classier way to say that, but if half of them are coming in negative, or about half, these are the extraordinary ones that had very good voyages. Now, if you take a look over time, oil was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859. After 1859, if you notice, the green line, which is whalebone, takes off in price. And whalebone was used for corsets, and it was used the way we use plastic today, because it was a flexible product that could bend, and yet it had significant strength. So whalebone really is what fueled a lot of the returns after 1859 when oil was discovered on land.
Then this is the price per whale or per pound?
Yes, it was either the price per gallon of oil or the price per gallon of sperm oil or the price per pound of whalebone. The spike in the 1865 era was based on the fact that that was during the Civil War and scarcity happened.
So what was the use of sperm oil and whale oil?
Sperm oil burned far more cleanly than whale oil, and therefore always had a bit of a higher valuation. They both could have been used for lighting. They could have been used for manufacturing. If something needed to be, any machinery needed to be lubricated, it was done with whale or sperm oil.
They weren't fuel at this early stage. They're more like, you said, candles and
lanterns.
Lighting. They're for illumination.
Lighting, mostly for lighting. So street lights were lit with whale oil.
And you said bone was built into products like the same way plastic is, because it was flexible but strong, like
yes.
In corsets for ladies.
Yes, and like horse whips.
Fascinating. Okay.
And if you take a look of analyzing the financial returns by cat, you can see at the end, whalebone is the majority of what people are getting money from.
Were they cutting up and getting the whalebone at sea, or were they bringing it all the way home? Because it's like 2-year, 3-year vessel life.
They were cutting the whale up, boiling it off for oil, and storing the bone.
When they were at sea. So
they are at sea. Now, the chances of coming home was about 92%. The chances of not coming home were about 8%. So as you look at this industry, there were many risks. So these are the boats that were announced as abandoned. A lot of the boats, if you notice up here, up by northern Alaska, happened during a couple big freezes. One of the big freezes was in 1876. Another one of the big freezes was in 1871. And that happened up in Alaska. And you can see that a majority or a bunch of those boats were abandoned there. And there are other abandonments. You can see there's one up by the Hudson Bay, and there are a bunch in the Azores and near the east coast of the US. A number of boats were burned. There's one here in the middle of the North Atlantic, and this boat supposedly was burned as its crew mutinied, and they lit the boat on fire without having another way to get off the boat or home. And the only reason this one was discovered was because the guys got into the little whaling boats and drifted to Bermuda, only to announce that their boat had been burned at sea due to a mutiny. These boats were condemned, which meant the harbor master in these ports decided that the boat was not seaworthy to go back into the ocean. The oil in these cases would have been saved and shipped back, but the boats were no longer of value and totaled. These are the boats, which is incredibly sad to me, that were just lost and never heard from again. And these boats, as I mentioned, each probably had about 20 men on them and never, ever heard from again.
Do we know the typical cause of loss? Was it storm? What was it?
I believe it most likely was storm. However, for all we know, it could have been the same as I mentioned. A bunch of guys mutinied, lit the boat on fire, and it sank, and no one heard from them again. But again, this is an awfully large number of boats never to be heard from again. During the Civil War, and even during some of the earlier international skirmishes, whaling boats were often seized. This is an estimation of where the boats were seized. As I said, most came from during the Civil War when England was affiliated with the Confederacy. And there were boats wandering the oceans trying to catch up with the whalers and take them over because the British and the Confederacy knew that whaling was one of the industrial engines of the North. This is the one I like the most. I've called this slide Revenge because in two cases, whaling boats were sunk by whales. One was the Essex and the other was the Anne Alexander. And the only reason we know that these boats were sunk by whales is someone survived to tell us. So if we go back to that lost slide, maybe there were a lot of rogue whales out there taking out some of those lost vessels as well. But the story of the Essex is some of the basis for the story of Moby Dick. If you put this all together, that is what the demise map looks like. There are probably about 909 to 912 voyages on this chart. And importantly, what I wanted to point out was whaling was an international industry. And boats got sunk, condemned, lost all over the world during the 1800s.
Now, were the records that you were looking at just of American-owned whaling boats?
Yes, I focused on the American-owned whaling boats, mostly because of the financial structure of how they were formed. There were whaling vessels out of England where the crew was paid a salary and it was owned in a more corporate structure rather than a syndicate of family structure. And I thought for financial analysis, being able to have comparable boats, it made sense to focus in an industry that had a similar financial structure.
What other countries engaged in the whaling business or industry?
A lot of the Scandinavian countries and England. I don't believe Europe was. And if you notice on this chart of where boats went down, there's very little in the Scandinavian and UK region. And I think that's because the US whalers sort of ceded that territory to those ships. France also did some, but they were not a large player.
Wow, fascinating research. And what's amazing is how low the returns were for this industry that lasted, was seemingly active for half a century and kind of lasted for a whole century. But they were not high returns. They were low returns, with the exception, as you astutely have pointed out, of the San Francisco sector of the industry.
I think there are a couple things that are going on. Often on the East Coast, I believe the whaling boat owners also might have owned the chandlery to outfit the boats, as well as the post-processing industry of creating candles or exporting the oil to Europe. So I believe there probably were solid returns in the supply chain. It just may not have been for the whaling boats themselves.
Now, I remember when racing in Nantucket a couple of times, people pointing out that sometime back in like 18-something, Nantucket was the richest city in America. Talk about that for a bit, would you please?
Predominance of whaling shifted from Nantucket off to New Bedford, mostly because there are some significant sandbars off of Nantucket. And therefore, Nantucket could not accommodate the larger vessels. One of the reasons I believe that Nantucket was so good at whaling before a lot of the rest of the New England was they had a lot of Native Americans on their boats. And the Native Americans had been familiar with killing whales in the 1700s. To Nantucket, some historic knowledge.
Wow.
And they did quite well for a while, but then as the boats got larger, the headquarters kind of shifted off to New Bedford and stayed there, with San Francisco being the most profitable harbor, but also the only one on the West Coast that had these ocean-going voyages. And there were two things that made New Bedford work. It was on railroad lines, and it had Deepwater Harbor. To get any materials off of Nantucket, you had to basically put it back on a boat and shift it to the mainland, which made the returns a little bit less because there was an extra freight charge in the mix.
So each boat's, you said, had a average crew of 20, and that means there's a captain and a boatswain. Give me the sort of org structure on the boat, and then the return each would earn.
The structure of the boat was a captain, a first mate, a second mate. The next level down was a bunch of men that were the harpooners. And then there were more generalized seamen. And the order of pay was the captain got paid the most. The next three levels of first mate, second mate, and even sometimes on the big boats, there were third mates, would get paid steps down from what the captain got paid. Harpooners were very valuable, and therefore they would get paid at an equivalency of what the mates were getting paid. Then the regular crew would be getting paid fractions, so like 1/200th of the take, whereas the captain could be getting something along the lines of 1/16th. But because captains were also often partial owners, it's hard to differentiate, because if a guy had gone to sea a number of times, he may have thrown his money in to be a partial owner and therefore get a larger percentage.
So now you said the useful life of these boats. Remind me again, what's the useful life of a typical whaling boat?
I used 50 years because some boats that I could see were in service for well over 70 years. And some looked like they had a 30-year life and then were condemned. And part of that, 90% of what I looked at were wooden hulled boats. And the problem with wooden hulled boats is that they take a lot of maintenance. So at different times, they coppered the bottoms.
As an owner of an 84-year-old antique racing boat, if we can delete that section, can we correct those numbers at all?
The length the boat lasted depended on the maintenance. And therefore, if a guy really loved his boat, he took better care of it. But we all know about barnacles and sea creatures, which really are not wooden boat friendly. So some boats even sank because the woodworms created holes. So 50 years is a guesstimate because so much depended on individual maintenance.
How many voyages at sea would a good captain have? You have any insight into how much tenure these guys would earn?
Some guys did 2 or 3 years, had a great, had a lovely run and built one of those lovely homes. It also depended on, let's say you were a San Francisco sea captain and you're only gone a year, and generally speaking, given the times, you were home every Christmas. You might want to do more voyages than the guy in New England that's gone for almost 2.5 years, not seeing his or her family, or his family in this case.
So you mentioned these, average 2-year voyages. Was there any seasonality to those?
The West Coast had a lot of seasonality where the boats would generally leave in January and come home in November. So that's kind of that 311 days. On the East, there was far less seasonality, probably mostly because the timing was less precise. And yet on the West Coast, you knew when the whales were going to show up around Alaska.
And so when a ship comes to its home base or a harbor, it would then offload its take with some kind of purser activity. What do you know about that?
Often boats, especially Hawaii, became a big port of call. So a boat would leave New England, whale what it could from the US and down along South America, sail to Hawaii, offload, freight the stuff home, and then have an empty boat to go up to Alaska and whale there. It would either come to San Francisco because freighting across the country on land was cheaper than going to Hawaii, where it would again have to be freighted by water.
Was there a size of boat that was more efficient or profitable in this practice?
I haven't been able to detect one, but different harbors had some different patterning. So boats out of, I believe it was Provincetown, tended to do shorter trips and generally up to the Hudson Bay area. And boats out of New Bedford went everywhere. Boats out of San Francisco probably rarely came to the Atlantic Ocean.
We're indebted to you for having such an incredibly cool insight into this. All the whale stories I've seen until now are all about the adventure, but not about the financial returns, which were driving the adventure, but about number of whaling trips that ships would take.
Again, it depends on how long it's sea. So if the average life was 50 years and each voyage was about 2 years, it probably was about 20 plus voyages because you need some time home to repair. Yet if you were going out of San Francisco and the voyages really only lasted a year, your boat probably could do more voyages.
So where were the financiers based who were engaging in the whale trade? Were they all New York? Tell me about that.
Most of it is New England, New Bedford, Nantucket, and the local people were investing in that. In San Francisco by the 1850s, I believe some of it still was New England because they knew how to outfit the boats and they knew where to go to sea. I think over time, more San Francisco-based people became involved. But I believe that San Francisco was originally funded by New Bedford and the New England area.
So, Bobby Coffey, we're so pleased that you have put all this research together. It gives us new insight in the whaling trade. Talk to us a little bit about the financial structure of these syndicates. And you used the term syndicate earlier. What was the corporate structure of the investor's relationship with the boat and so on?
Generally speaking, there were 4 or 5 investors, could be even more, but each person would put money in and get a stake out. So you would own an eighth of the boat or a 16th of the boat, and that would be your percentage ownership of the boat. You'd be responsible for that percentage ownership of those costs. And when the boat came back, that percentage would be your take. So you were in a partnership with as many as 16 other people who were responsible for this boat.
This is such fascinating research. Tell me, where in the beautiful institution of Princeton do you fit organizationally? What's the structure inside where you fit?
I am a librarian, so I work in the library and report up the library structure. There are about 50 industry specialists. So I'm the finance specialist. There are history specialists. There are politics specialists. And we each have our own corner of the world and research. At Princeton, every junior and senior needs to do independent work, which is why they have so many industry specialists for us to help the students and faculty doing research find the data and materials they need to do their independent work. And it's such a treat to work with the kids. They're just fabulous.
So when you took up this subject, could you have colleagues who were grad students? And what do you mostly serve students?
I serve students. If faculty need me, of course they find me, but most of my time is spent working with undergrads more than graduates because the Master's in Finance program at Princeton doesn't require independent work the way undergraduate work does.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And so when you were hunting around for, corroborating evidence for the return information, where else beside the New Bedford Whaling Museum and the Mystic Museum, which is also a beautiful facility, where else would you look?
A couple of the documents came from Harvard's Baker Library. There were some materials that they had scanned that were incredibly valuable. So there was a congressional speech done by the New Bedford representative to Congress about how much it costs to go to sea. And that was in the Baker Library scanned documents. So I thank someone in special collections at Harvard for doing that. And similarly, there was a document by Joseph Diaz that cataloged only the New Bedford whalers. And the best part of that was he had commentary of this vessel was bought from Nantucket, and these were the owners, and this vessel got lost at sea in the Cayman Islands. And that work was most valuable for the commentary. There were 11 vessels named the Franklin. So tracking down each vessel was a lot of work.
So what about piracy during the whaling trade?
I didn't hear anything about piracy. What I did hear about was some of the South Seas islands were still quite dangerous, where the natives would burn your boat to the ground. Or there were rumors of cannibalism. So a lot of the whalers avoided the South Sea islands. And I believe the other interesting piece, remnant of history, was these boats were going to sea during the slave trade. And there were only 2 whalers that were known to have ever departed from whaling to go into the slave trade. And I think part of that may be the Quaker background of many of the ship owners who did not believe in slavery at all.
So those of us, who've spent time in the Valley think about the famous VCs. We think of Kleiner Perkins, Sequoia, Excel, Norwest Partners, etc., which I've had the pleasure of dealing with all 4 of those. And so now I'm wondering, what kind of investors did you come up with that seem to be repeatedly successful investors in the whaling trade?
There's such a thing in the whaling trade called agents. And the agents are the ones that put together these voyages and make sure they collect all the investors, are investors themselves, and are the ones to make sure the boats are crewed. There's some data on which boats are backed by which agents, were put together by which agents. There's some data, again, I think it's about 2/3 of the boats are marked with different agents. And I haven't yet done the analysis of which agents did particularly well or did particularly poorly. But that's the next chapter. This was fascinating research to do, and I'm surprised. Well, first of all, I'm thankful for the New Bedford Whaling Museum and Mystic putting together the catches of all these vessels. This work would not have been possible without their investigations and their finding all these vessels. My work was putting the financial analysis to it.
And invaluable work it is. So, Bobby Coffey, thank you very much for being our guest on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon with one of the more fascinating tales that we've heard. Thanks very much for your great presentation.
And if people have questions, just email me. It's bcoffey@princeton.edu.
Wonderful, wonderful. Princeton has lots of reason to be proud of your great research, Bobby. Thank you so much. And you're welcome, of course, to come visiting at the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon when you come to San Francisco, and we will see if there is any more of those whalers left.
Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.